In the first part of this special feature, we review how 7 years of austerity policies and state dismantling paved the way for local criminal gangs to co-opt the state, acting on behalf of international crime holdings, controlling trillions of dollars known as cartels. We explore President Daniel Noboa's response to the institutional and security crisis, wherein he militarized the nation and declared an internal state of war against criminal bands plaguing the streets. While this strategy initially led to a high number of detentions, its long-term effectiveness remained uncertain. However, beyond the heroic narrative of a young president battling cartels lies another aspect of this crisis: the class struggle. This not only determines who bears the brunt of the internal war, but also who will control trillions of dollars worth of natural resources. Integral to Daniel Noboa's government plan is an alliance with the United States. Ecuador has signed 3 treaties with the hegemon, granting unprecedented concessions in exchange for institutional and security assistance for an initial 10-year period. It seems evident that Ecuador assaulted Mexico's embassy in part because it has the full support of the United States. Also, the failed sale of Russian weapons to Ukraine seems to indicate a careless yet aggressive Ecuadorian regime, not afraid to break treaties and rules as long as they can get away with it. Masked within the treaty is the US ability to deploy military personnel with full immunity and authorization to use lethal force. President Noboa's internal war provision will label the enemy as terrorist. This perpetuates a seemingly endless war fueled by a large supply of desperate, poor, and dirty money. We spoke to Augusto Tandazo, Doctor of Jurisprudence and Political Analyst.
Nos hicieron creer que estamos ante una guerra. Estamos ante un tema de determinados focos, obviamente, de gente que está vinculada a carteles, posiblemente.
They made us believe that we're facing a war. Obviously, we're facing an issue of certain focal points, of people who are possibly linked to cartels, who've demonstrated certain displays of power and isolation. The second additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, the Protocol of 1977, says the following. It states that when there is a case of internal armed conflict, it must be demonstrated that there's control over a part of the territory by armed dissident groups. In Ecuador, there is none. Not a single block, not a single hectare controlled by any gang. So there is no territorial control by anyone. And according to the protocol, sustained military operations mean that there is an army in control, in a territory that it controls, in which they have a permanent military presence. That is needed. There is no military presence here from any group related to the gangs.
Eso se necesita. Aquí no hay presencia militar de ningún grupo que esté relacionado con las bandas.
Even this protocol of the Geneva Convention states that it shall not apply to situations of internal tensions, internal disturbances such as riots, isolated acts of violence, and other analogous acts that are not armed conflicts.
Two legal associations, supported by the International Network of Civil Liberties Organization, have presented motions arguing a premeditated, incorrect classification of the conflict. They argue that an important component of these networks was the control over the jails, to use them as bases of operations and recruitment. Other important assets for those bands are ports, airports, and border passes, all under the control of the Ecuadorian state, a state that they are not trying to destroy, which is a requisite for such classification, according to international law. Oscar Valderas is a Mexican journalist and author, specialized in criminal gangs and narco-terrorism.
There is a distinction that I make regarding terrorist and criminal organizations. Terrorist organizations seek to destroy a state in order to establish themselves as authorities. Destroy the state to build upon that destroyed state a new one, right? Criminal organizations do not have that logic. Criminal organizations do not desire to destroy the state. They need to associate with the state to use it for what interests them most, which is to be a profit-making machine. It's pure capitalism.
It has been demonstrated by at least 4 judicial cases all over the newspapers that the co-option of the Ecuadorian state ran deep, possibly all the way to the highest levels. After all, the last 3 presidents cannot go back to Ecuador due to high-profile corruption cases. Lasso in particular had very close friends caught in deals with the Balkan Mafia. One of them even got murdered. Yet the fury of the state has been unleashed on the streets, and while this seems necessary at the moment, it is unclear if this emergency power will be returned once the crisis is over. And it is also unclear if winning this war is an attainable goal at all, or rather a convenient state of affairs.
Lenin Moreno.
We spoke with political radio commentator Enrique Vivanco.
Aparece medio entre los arbustos, así como Homero Simpson en ese meme que está escondido atrás del césped. Aparece Noboa.
In the electoral process, appearing from out of the bushes, just like Homer Simpson in that meme, Noboa appears. And of course, I believe that the political right in Ecuador elected him as the definitive president. He's the definitive president
porque lo están
because they're
proyectando
projecting
para
him
que
to last
dure
until
hasta el
2034.
2035. Daniel Noboa es un personaje, como tú dijiste, nace en Miami, educado en Harvard, tiene sus hijos.
Daniel
nacen en
Noboa
Miami.
is a character who,
Recién se
as you
fue
said,
a
was
que
born
su
in
hijo
Miami,
nazca allá.
educated at Harvard. His
Se va a
children
la
were born
pelea
in
del Chito
Miami.
Vera en Miami.
He just
Se
left
va,
for
o
his
sea,
son to be born in Miami.
es un
He also attended the
presidente
Cheeto Vera UFC fight in Miami.
completamente,
I mean, he's a complete president.
algunos dirán amistoso con los
Some will
Estados
say
Unidos,
he's friendly
otros
to the
dirán
United States.
entregado a
Others
los
will say he's
Estados Unidos,
devoted to the
que
United
procede
States,
con los
someone who will
acuerdos,
execute the bilateral
que
agreements, someone who
recibe
welcomes
a
Laura
Laura
Richardson as an honored
como
guest,
un huésped
when we all know that Laura Richardson has said
de
publicly that
honor,
what she wants are the
cuando
natural
todos
resources of the
sabemos que
region.
Laura Richardson ha dicho públicamente que ella lo que quiere son los recursos naturales de la región.
Contrary to the way it has been portrayed, only parts of this agreement were signed by President Noboa due to the emergency. It is important to understand that this was conceived and negotiated by President Lasso years prior to the declaration of internal war by Noboa. On December 15, President Lasso and Biden met at the White House. The presidents spoke for about an hour and agreed on a plan to strengthen ties between the two countries. Among the important issues discussed were development loans, assistance for economic development to prevent migratory flux, protecting biodiversity, and addressing the challenge of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. It is noted in the meeting's transcript that part of the United States' interest stemmed from Ecuador's commencement of a two-year tenure in the United Nations Security Council, and especially to obtain President Lasso's declaration of unrestricted support for Ukraine. At the time of the treaty signing, Guillermo Lasso was politically weakened, simply waiting to be replaced, and in no position to sign something so vital. Nevertheless, he did so anyway. Almost a year later, this very public security crisis, headlined by the TV kidnappings on January 9, allowed the newly elected president, Daniel Noboa, to expedite the treaty through the courts instead of Congress, without encountering any significant political opposition. It is important to notice that all of this planning by US and Ecuadorian elites was nearly derailed, because the election was forecast to be won by Luisa González, candidate for Citizens Revolution, a party dreaded by the Ecuadorian right, who was leading the polls far and away. In fact, if you look at this poll from September 2023, you can see the lead by more than 15 points by González. Elected President Daniel Noboa is not even in the chart. Then, candidate Fernando Villavicencio was publicly assassinated just days before the election. After that, right-wing candidates and mainstream media blamed the murder on the leftist party, and Noboa found himself president. The accusations for the killing vanished after the election. The case was quickly covered up in mud, and it remains unresolved to this day. Most of the gunmen had been killed in captivity by the Los Lobos gang, the same gang that was accused of the murder of the presidential candidate last year before the elections. And the eventual attack on the TV station on February 9, this gang is said to be the enforcing arm of the Balkan Mafia, the same group that was found to have links with the Lasso administration.
The fact that Lasso has approved this treaty and that President Noboa is requesting its ratification, along with the constitutional okay given by the Constitutional Court in an irritated manner, implies that there is a continued succession of neoliberal policies between Lasso and Noboa.
But who is Daniel Noboa? Daniel Noboa was groomed to rule. His father, the richest man in the country, ran 5 presidential campaigns. And as a conservative family man, Álvaro Noboa integrated his family all along this political process. Daniel Noboa saw it all. He also saw the bitter and costly feud between his father and Rafael Correa. And even though he does not talk much about it, you could argue that the resentment goes deep. Daniel Noboa's son was in fact born in Miami, Florida, United States. He mainly grew up in Guayaquil, although weekend trips to the States are common at that level of wealth. In fact, he was part of the elite in both worlds. He was educated in Harvard and some of the best universities of the United States. If you look at his record, there is an evident 5-year ramping up on preparation to being president. And while you could argue that a person that prepared for the job and the support of the most powerful army in the world is exactly what Ecuador needs, you could also wonder, with all this emergency power amounting to a blank check, whose interest will be looked after?
Este nuevo gobierno, este presidente, me parece que tiene muchos elementos estéticos.
This new government, this president seems to me to have many facets. Aesthetics are very well presented by the press because, in the end, Daniel is unique. He's married to a gastronomic influencer who's into diets and a bit of feminine beauty. He has a son who's the grandson of Alvaro Noboa, and he has another son who was just born named after his maternal grandfather. I find in this family a kind of parallel with European monarchical families, because everything is beautiful, they are handsome, they have all the money in the world, they dress how they want and eat wherever they want, they go to Miami whenever they feel like it. Daniel Noboa governs with sunglasses. Imagine, that's an element that the Ecuadorian press is highlighting. They find it striking and put it in a headline in a press release. Daniel Noboa governs with sunglasses.
Les parece llamativo y lo ponen en un titular, en una nota de prensa. Daniel Noboa gobierna con gafas.
If you put aside the security response to the crisis, you could see that Noboa in fact forgave tax debts to private interest groups and individuals in the amount of 274 million. He then raised consumption taxes on the general public at a rate of 3%. Noboa imposed a treaty with the US without a congressional debate on the matter. He passed a very polemic free trade agreement with China, and he's now imposing new austerity measures, like setting the frame for mass layoffs and other compromises included in agreements with finance organizations like the IMF.
Lasso and Noboa are the same, and they are united by the Ecuadorian ambassador to the United States, Yvonne Baki, who negotiated this treaty.
On December 15, 2022, in Washington, D.C., U.S. Senators Bob Menendez and Jim Risch, then chairman and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, were joined by Senators Tim Kaine, Marco Rubio, Chris Coons, Bill Cassidy, and Ben Cardin, after the bipartisan United States-Ecuador Partnership Act of 2022 was approved by Congress as part of the National Defense Authorizations Act, NDAA, for the fiscal year 2023. During the ceremony, the senators make remarks that clearly identify some of the goals of the Intergovernmental and Interagency Alliance. Senator Rubio noted that in the context of a far-left and openly socialist governments dominant in our hemisphere, Ecuador is a strategic partner. Ranking member Rich celebrated that the bill will support Ecuador in developing resilience against state and non-state malign influences. Although Senator Rich did not mention names, it is a logical leap to assume that by foreign state influence, he meant China and Russia. Regarding the harmful influence of malign domestic actors, referred to by Senate Bill 3591 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023, it will be logical to assume that it refers to the indigenous and anti-mining movements. They have carried out labor strikes that have altered national policies, deterred international treaties and mining projects many times over, and not just under the neoliberal governments of Moreno and Lasso, but also under Correa before them. This is the same country that has witnessed 5 popular revolts, 3 of which toppled neoliberal governments and disrupted neoliberal agendas on issues like seeds, raw resources exploitation, and constitutional rights. Ecuador's indigenous movement is unique and one of the few left peaceful movements with real social power. We decided to speak with the main leader of one of those non-state malign influences.
La pobreza absoluta como un colchón de reclutamiento del narcotráfico ha sido utilizada, porque eso es la palabra, ha sido
Absolute
utilizada,
poverty as a recruitment cushion for drug trafficking has been used because that is the word, it has been used. It has not been built as such, it has been used to declare terrorism. In this case, they use young people who are a consequence of poverty.
de la pobreza. Porque si usted ve en los medios de comunicación, y aquí hay una profundización de la lucha de clases.
Because if you look in the media, there is a deepening of the class struggle. If you look on social networks at those poor vassals, those poor drug addicts, those who have not had the opportunity to go to school, university, they do not have the right to a job, they're practically starving in the neighborhoods and the suburbs of Guayaquil, Quito, are declared terrorists. So the concept is such. If you look at terrorism, it is directed to confront the poor.
Está dirigido para enfrentar a los pobres. El narcotráfico en el año más o menos está moviendo.
The drug trafficking in the year more or less is moving $60 billion, a similar quota, according to the president himself, similar to the external debt of Ecuador. The question is, do these $60 billion, do they benefit? Are they managed by those poor serfs, drug addicts, results of the entire poverty process? Or is there a social class linked to drug trafficking? A social class, political, economic, linked to drug trafficking, which benefits from it and is feeding the capitalist economic system, whether it be financial, the financial system, or the industrial system, whether it be real estate system, and other economic activities.
Ya sea el sistema industrial, ya sea el sistema de inmobiliarias y otras actividades económicas.
Ecuador possesses immense untapped wealth in potential raw resources such as copper, oil, rare earth minerals, and gold. Curiously enough, the provision also covers the fight against illegal mining, a business that was controlled by cartels. It is unclear if this will mean shutting down the illegal projects or exploiting them. And the more important question becomes, will the government continue to open up other projects by passing local dissent? This is something every administration ultimately failed to do in the face of popular resistance. It is in fact the defining social conflict in Ecuador, the conflict for nature.
Las clases económicas poderosas del poder realmente existente en el Ecuador.
The powerful economic classes, the real power existing in Ecuador, after the popular strikes of 2019 and 2022, the elites have already demanded that Kana'i be declared terrorists. In this scenario, the President of the Republic has already stated this in recent days, that there is no time to go to the mobilization, and if they go out to the mobilization, they will face the army. That's what he's been saying these days. So it's set up to fight the poor with bullets. The groundwork is being prepared to declare those of us who fight for the rights declared in the Constitution and in the world terrorists.
For a generation of people who saw the Plan Condor implemented in South America, the thought of having US troops operating with total impunity in the context of a militarized society does not sit well. ISA sees a resurgence of US dominance in the region in the face of a potential new Cold War, implemented under the cover of the war on drugs and now the war on crime turned terror.
En total, en todo el continente, nuestro controlado 46 bases militares.
In total, 46 military bases were established throughout our continent. It hasn't controlled anything. The problem is that this is solely and exclusively designed for geopolitical control for North American political needs. There is no sovereignty, no intention to solve problems, and it is absolute subjugation of our country. Worst of all, they have taken advantage in this scenario of indignation and of uncertainty in the fight against drug trafficking. It's normalized. It's normalized. Can you imagine in what kind of unpatriotic mood, unpatriotic feeling can we allow for external forces to enter our country and have impunity in whatever they do?
Venga fuerzas externas y tenga impunidad en lo que hagan.
It is entirely likely that the military control wielded by the state due to the emergency of narc-terrorism will be used against the indigenous and farmers who dare to defend their lands and rivers. On March 4, 2024, President Daniel Noboa was a keynote speaker at the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada convention in Toronto. Accompanied by high functionaries of his cabinet, he spoke to some of the richest mining investors in the world.
This government will always be open for Canadian investment, will always be open to people that take the risk and believe not only in our nation, but believe in our government, believe in our people.
Learning from past mistakes, Ecuador corporate sector, led by a true poster boy for the elite, has the pieces in place to finally impose their long-time across administration's agenda of submitting the country and its people to corporate rule. Even if it goes against popular will, and even if it destroys the rivers and the mountains that are so valuable to the small farmers, indigenous, and tourism sectors. After all, referendums about the matter have been won by anti-mining forces more than once. It remains to be seen how this new Ecuadorian state of militarized corporatism deals with the indigenous and farmers who resist the takeover of their lands. Will they be considered terrorists? Will they be declared a subversive movement? Time will tell, but bearing a radical change of affairs, this could be checkmate.